Imagine this: a hospital ship, filled with wounded children and doctors, is deliberately destroyed in cold blood. No mercy. No warning. Just silence and death in the void. Now imagine the people of Earth finding out, and deciding that mercy would never be an option again. Stay with me, because what happens next will shake the galaxy to its core. Before we dive in, make sure you watch this video all the way to the end. Trust me, you do not want to miss how humanity rewrote the rules of war forever. Welcome to HFY Sci-Fi Love and War Story, where we bring you the boldest tales of humanity's courage, fury, and unexpected mercy among the stars. If you love epic stories of love, war, and survival, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Here's a secret code for our loyal viewers: type mercy or fury in the comments if you're ready to fight alongside humanity. Let's see who's truly paying attention. Now, let's begin our story. Commander Vex Thorn adjusted the stiff collar of his uniform and watched the burning remains of the NSC Mercy drift across the endless black. The view from the bridge was picturesque in a way that only professional butchery could be: jagged shards of white hull spinning lazily, medical banners curling into cinders, and a scattering of bodies, tiny and helpless, tumbling silently into oblivion. Vex sipped a thick, sour drink from his ration cup, savoring the moment. Humans, he sneered to his crew, for eyes narrowing. So weak. So naive. Even their ships beg for mercy. The bridge crew gave the required chuckle, though it sounded more like the scrape of knives than laughter. None dared mention that the NSC Mercy had been clearly marked: massive red crosses, universal peace signals, broadcast frequencies screaming "NON combatant" in 27 galactic languages. Minor details. Details for historians and lawyers. Not conquerors. Lieutenant Praise, a twitchy thing with too many limbs for comfort, shuffled forward, stammering, "Sir, transmission logs confirmed, over 2,000 patients, including juveniles, from various species." Vex waved him off like a man batting a fly. Collateral damage. The message matters. Not the debris. The message, Vex thought smugly, was simple: humanity would learn its place at the boot of the hegemony. Yet somewhere beneath the satisfaction coiling around his blackened heart, a small, alien feeling stirred. He crushed it quickly. Reflection was for poets and priests. He was a soldier. Worse, a patriot. On Earth, Admiral Juno Kapoor stood before the United Earth Defense Council, the final moments of the Mercy looping behind her in ghostly holograms. The screams had been muted, but somehow the silence was worse. 2,417 souls, she said, her voice sharp and controlled like a surgeon's scalpel. Doctors. Children. Aliens who trusted us more than their own governments. They were burned because we chose to believe in peace longer than we should have. No one in the room argued. What could they say? That war was ugly? That evil rarely introduced itself properly before sitting at the table? History already had enough fools making speeches about the necessity of violence while standing ankle-deep in the blood of those they failed to protect. Kapoor looked out over the council chamber, her dark eyes steady. The hegemony believes we are soft. They believe kindness is weakness. They believe they have broken us. Her lip curled into something halfway between a grimace and a snarl. They have made the last mistake of their lives. The decision was not voted upon. Protocol Thunderbolt, the Earth Fleet's grim insurance policy, was activated with a simple nod from President Okoro. The galaxy, so used to seeing humans as squabbling infants barely out of their cradle, was about to meet another side of Earth. The side humans buried deep because they were terrified of what they might become if they let it breathe. Back aboard the inevitable Dominance, Captain Zilra Mox frowned at the data streaming across her console. No mass evacuations from Mars. No fleet scrambles. No panic transmissions. Just a cold, dead silence. A veteran of dozens of conquests, Zilra recognized patterns, and this was wrong. "Commander, we should proceed with caution," she said, her scaled fingers tapping a warning pattern into her console. "The humans are behaving differently. Vex laughed, a sound like oil bubbling in a poisoned river. Let them cower in their homes. It will make their submission easier. Zora almost admired the man's ability to ignore reality. It took a special breed of stupid to see a storm on the horizon and comment on how pleasant the breeze felt. Outside the bridge viewport, the debris of the Mercy drifted onward. A bloodstain on the fabric of space. Humanity, for all its faults, its endless wars, its tribal hatreds, its cruel amusements, had learned one thing very well over thousands of years: when you punch a human hard enough, they don't fall down. They look up. And then they get mean. Commander Vex Thorn wouldn't understand that. He was too busy adjusting his medals in the mirror, rehearsing speeches about inevitable victory. When the first human warship dropped out of stealth behind Luna, unnoticed and coiled like a waiting predator, Vex was in the officer's lounge, bragging to an uninterested aide about the time he personally vaporized a city with minimal fuss. By the time he realized the humans hadn't surrendered, hadn't begged for peace, but had instead prepared something so ruthless, so methodical, so human. It was already far, far too late. History would later record Commander Thorn's tactical decision-making that day under the technical military classification of Oops. Admiral Juno Kapoor had spent her entire life preparing for a war she prayed would never come. As she stood before the United Earth Defense Council, the looping hologram behind her showed the Mercy's last moments, the desperate flare of medical beacons, the futile cries for help, the sudden, merciless eruption of plasma fire. In another time, another history, maybe humanity would have responded with speeches. Maybe there would have been candlelight vigils, hashtags, and a few strongly worded diplomatic notes sent to indifferent stars. But Mercy was not just a ship. It was a promise. And promises, when broken, bled far worse than flesh. Juno's voice was steady, but every word tasted like iron. Protocol Thunderbolt is active. Effective immediately. Across the council chamber, hardened diplomats who had survived 3 economic collapses and 2 near wars stiffened. Some turned pale. A few just closed their eyes, whispering old prayers they no longer believed in. Thunderbolt was not just war. Thunderbolt was a confession. A confession that peace was always a gamble humanity had been ready to lose. Years ago, after first contact, Earth's leaders had smiled politely at the hegemony's envoys while their shipyards built quietly in the dark. Every smiling treaty, every photo op, every hollow promise of peace had been signed with one hand, while the other hand loaded the gun. Juno remembered the early debates, the idealists scoffing, the pragmatists gritting their teeth. She had sat through endless committee meetings, listening to old men argue whether building a secret fleet was paranoid or realistic. She remembered one senator, now dead, sneering. No one will ever fire on a hospital ship. How ironic, she thought bitterly, that arrogance had a shelf life shorter than milk. Now the preparations were over. Now the masks could come off. As she issued the final launch orders, Juno thought briefly of her younger self, fresh-faced, hopeful, believing that humanity could finally be better than its bloodstained past. A child's dream. Burned away with the Mercy. Across Earth's hidden military installations, doors sealed with 20-digit codes slid open for the first time in decades. Massive battleships, each bristling with weapons humanity had never officially invented, rose from dry docks buried beneath Antarctica's ice sheets, from tunnels gouged into lunar caverns, from forgotten asteroid mining colonies now revealed to be vast arsenals. The stars that had looked down with pity on Earth's primitive species would soon have reason to blink twice. Protocol Thunderbolt wasn't just a counterattack. It was an admission that humanity, at its core, remembered every betrayal it had ever suffered. The hegemony had destroyed a hospital ship to teach Earth a lesson. Now Earth would return the favor, with a lesson written in fleet formation so tight, and weapons fire so overwhelming, that the galaxy would tremble long after the debris cooled. General Felix Powell, one of the few who had voted against delaying Thunderbolt, stood silently beside Juno as reports streamed in. Mars colonies, ordered to shelter in place. Military AIs, moving from passive defense to full engagement. Strike fleets, entering launch sequences like clockwork. Felix lit a battered cigarette, despite council regulations banning smoking within 10 kilometers of anything vaguely expensive. He offered Juno one. She shook her head. Funny thing about humans, he rasped, exhaling a long plume of smoke. We're awful at peace. But we're very, very good at revenge. Kapoor said nothing. She didn't have to. Somewhere, above the moon's shadow, Thunderbolt's first wave was already coalescing, the silent, lethal promise of a species that had clawed its way through every kind of hell its own hands could build. And at the center of it all, wrapped in the cold logic of retaliation, was one undeniable truth. Humanity had not survived its own madness for thousands of years just to kneel to aliens who thought blowing up sick children was tactically appropriate. They had survived because when pushed too far, they became something even nightmares learned to avoid. Somewhere, back aboard the inevitable Dominance, Commander Vex Thorn admired his own reflection in a polished surface, brushing imaginary lint from his uniform and preparing his glorious victory speech. He was, at that very moment, practicing his smile. It was a tragedy, really. Nobody had told him that in about 6 hours, his only audience would be a small, extremely aggressive boarding party armed with railguns and a sincere dislike for genocidal maniacs. But at least he'd have the smile down perfectly for the court-martial photo. Commander Vex Thorn lounged in the command chair of the inevitable Dominance like a man awaiting applause he hadn't yet earned. Around him, the bridge bustled with orchestrated efficiency. Screens glowed with the ghostly light of the wreckage they had left behind, the shattered Mercy still spinning out its final, silent prayers into a universe that wasn't listening. Vex tapped his clawed finger against the armrest. Humans, he mused, were tragically predictable. They would scream, cry, wave pathetic diplomatic protests, then roll over, showing their soft underbelly, like every species before them. He almost pitied them. Almost. Across the bridge, Captain Zilra Mox reviewed sensor readings with a knot tightening in her gut. In 20 years of conquest, she had learned to recognize the difference between fear and fury. Fear was messy, scattered, transmissions overloaded, escape pods launched, desperate fleets throwing themselves into hopeless battles. But this? Mars was silent. Earth was silent. The human colonies in the asteroid belt, silent. It wasn't submission. It wasn't panic. It was something far worse. It was the stillness before a blade was drawn. Zilra had seen it once before, in the eyes of a cornered animal, wounded but unbroken, deciding whether to flee or to bite clean through the hunter's throat. She shifted uneasily, her scaled skin rippling with unease. Vex, in contrast, was in fine spirits. Prepare the bombardment sequence, he ordered with a theatrical wave. Let's show these mammals what real power looks like. Zilra hesitated. Commander, we should reconsider. Their behavior is predictable, Vex snapped. They are primates with delusions of grandeur. Let them learn humility. In that moment, Zilra understood something fundamental about her commander. He didn't hate the humans. He didn't fear them. He simply didn't respect them. That was going to get them all killed. Still, she complied. Hegemony discipline left little room for independent thought, a flaw that had served them well against lesser species, and would, she suspected, be their undoing here. As the Dominance turned toward Mars, long-range sensors flickered, struggling to pierce the radio silence. Reports filtered in slowly, like rain before a storm. No evacuations. No distress signals. No last stands. Just darkness. Perhaps they've accepted their fate, Vex mused aloud, smiling. Sensible. Saves us the trouble. Zilra doubted it. Humans didn't lie still and die quietly. They fought. They raged. And when they lost, they remembered and built monuments so future generations could rage harder. But Vex didn't want to hear that. He wanted trophies, not warnings. On Earth, Admiral Kapoor stood in a Cold War room deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean, her hand resting lightly on the ancient oak table where humanity's first space treaties had once been signed in naive hope. She remembered, bitterly, how they had once dreamed that war was a disease that could be cured with enough diplomacy, with enough treaties, with enough faith in sentient decency. Now she knew better. War wasn't a disease. It was a symptom of being alive in a universe that valued power over principles. And when faced with an empire that murdered children to make a point, there was only one rational response. Total, overwhelming, unrelenting fury. In orbit, the first formations of Thunderbolt fleets activated stealth drives so advanced they made light itself flinch. Thousands of humans, soldiers, engineers, pilots, braced themselves for the battle to come. Not for glory. Not for conquest. But for the memory of every soul burned aboard the Mercy, screaming into the dark where no help came. Meanwhile, back aboard the inevitable Dominance, Commander Vex called for a celebration. Victory, he declared grandly, is inevitable. Some junior officers managed a weak cheer. Most simply exchanged nervous glances. Because deep down, even the most loyal Hegemony crewmen understood a fundamental, unspoken truth. Whenever a commander started giving speeches about how inevitable victory was, it usually meant someone, somewhere, had just screwed up spectacularly. They were just all hoping it wasn't them. Spoiler, it was. The first sign of doom wasn't the flashing alarms. It wasn't the frantic calls from junior officers or the sudden panic tightening in Captain Zilra's chest. It was silence. Real silence. Not the comforting hum of a vessel in command, not the sterile hush of waiting for orders, but the gut-deep, ancient kind of silence, the kind a prey animal hears a second before the jaw snaps shut. Commander Vex Thorn didn't notice, of course. He was too busy polishing his personal commendation speech, rehearsing lines about unprecedented victory and textbook planetary subjugation. He never got to deliver it. The tactical officer's voice cracked first. Sir, multiple contacts emerging from Lunar Shadow. Vex frowned, irritated at the interruption. Transport ships? No, sir. Warships. Another voice joined, raw with disbelief. Over 70 vessels detected, and growing. Zilra's blood chilled. She pushed past the stunned ensign and stared at the data herself. It wasn't just the number. It was the formation, perfect, silent, disciplined. Not the scattershot desperation of a species facing extinction. No. This was a trap. Carefully planned. Meticulously executed. She turned to Vex, her voice low and sharp. Commander, we are not facing panic. We are facing preparation. He sneered, unwilling, or unable, to believe. Their fleet is a handful of antiques. Even combined, they barely scraped together 30 frigates. Another alarm blared. Sir, updated scan, unknown vessels now over 100. Heavily armed. Drive signatures, unknown. Zilra didn't bother hiding her contempt anymore. Humanity, the so-called primitives, had been busy. And they had been very, very quiet about it. The screen flickered as new images came into focus, lines of sleek, brutal-looking warships, their hulls gleaming like the knives of gods. Not the ugly, functional designs Hegemony intelligence had filed away in dusty archives. No, these were weapons designed by people who didn't build monuments to war. They built war itself into an art form. The bridge crew stared, frozen in the realization that their centuries-old doctrines had just been set on fire, doused in fuel, and kicked off a cliff. A burst of static. Then a voice, clear and calm. Hegemony Vessel Inevitable Dominance, this is Admiral Juno Kapoor of Earth Fleet Command. The name hit the bridge like a slap. You fired on a hospital ship. I want you to know, that was a mistake you won't live long enough to regret. Silence. Even Vex, ever the caricature of Hegemony arrogance, hesitated. Because there was something in that human voice, something old, something sharp, that spoke of graves dug and cities burned long before aliens ever looked at Earth through a telescope. He rallied his bravado like a man using a wet paper bag as a shield. You dare threaten the Hegemony? Vex barked. You are one species. Correct, Kapoor cut him off smoothly. One species. Built by centuries of slaughtering each other over rocks, rivers, and ideas. What did you think would happen when you gave us a real reason to fight together? The fleet expanded on the tactical display, like a blooming iron flower. Hundreds of ships. Hundreds more emerging behind them. An unstoppable tide of vengeance made metal. Zilra looked at the screen. Then back at her commander, whose face had drained of all color. For a moment, a brief, painfully human moment, Zilra pitied him. Pity for a man who had spent his whole life believing victory was a birthright. Only to find out he was just another fool waiting to be footnoted by history. On Earth, thousands of men and women sat in the cockpits of ships no one outside classified briefings had ever seen. They didn't shout war cries. They didn't pray for glory. They remembered the children who never came home from mercy. The patients who had died screaming, unseen and unmourned. They remembered, and their hands tightened on the triggers. Aboard the inevitable dominance, Vex finally found his voice, trembling with the realization clawing up his spine. Prepare defensive formations. It was almost adorable, really. Like telling ants to form a defensive line against the tsunami. Zilra, to her credit, didn't argue. She simply keyed in the alert protocols with the detached professionalism of someone ordering coffee 5 minutes before the asteroid hits. The first human salvo arrived seconds later. Massive kinetic rounds, invisible beams, plasma storms so dense they melted shielding tech that had once been described as invincible in the Hegemony's recruitment brochures. The Dominance staggered under the assault, hull plating peeling away like rotten bark. Shields collapsing, screamed the tactical officer. Vex just stood there, mouth working uselessly, as if he could chew his way out of physics. Zilra braced herself against the railing, watching systems fail one by one, wondering if they would even have the dignity of an explosion, or if they would just drift into history as another embarrassing anecdote for human cadets to laugh about in basic training. And somewhere, deep in the irrational part of her mind where humor survived everything, a thought struck her. Maybe next time, we should try shooting the warships instead of the hospital ones first. Commander Vex Thorn never heard the first volley. One moment, the bridge of the inevitable dominance was full of grumbling officers and static-filled sensors. The next, the world simply broke. The shields, ancient marvels of hegemony superiority, collapsed under the weight of human firepower like wet paper. Panels exploded. Gravity buckled. The mighty warship groaned under the insult, as if it could not comprehend a reality where it was no longer invincible. Vex hit the deck hard, blood oozing from a cut above one eye. He blinked up at the chaos around him, at the officers scrambling, shouting, dying, and realized something that no amount of propaganda could erase. The humans hadn't brought a battle. They had brought a judgment. Zilra Mox, somehow still standing, barked orders that nobody heard over the shriek of dying systems. In her mind, she replayed the final images of the Mercy, the white ship ablaze, tumbling through space, its peaceful insignia shattered. She wondered, briefly, if the humans had replayed those same images before firing. The second volley was even worse. Weapons designed for planetary sieges smashed into the Dominance's hull from a dozen angles, severing power conduits, shattering the spinal supports. The ship spun drunkenly, hemorrhaging atmosphere and pride. Engines offline, screamed a technician. Long-range comms, gone, another cried. Life support critical, a third added, unnecessarily. Commander Vex staggered upright, rage replacing the shock. This is impossible, he bellowed. No one answered. Not because they disagreed, but because somewhere deep in their bones, they understood. Reality didn't care what was impossible anymore. It cared about what was happening. A calm voice crackled over the battered comms, Admiral Juno Kapoor, her tone almost conversational. I told you, Commander Thorn. That was a mistake you won't live long enough to regret. A smaller human vessel, fast, elegant, lethal, slid into formation beside the broken Dominance. Boarding signals activated. Not to conquer. To deliver a message. Inside the battered bridge, stunned silence reigned as Kapoor's words continued. You destroyed mercy, she said. You murdered the innocent. You spat on everything that civilization pretends to hold sacred. And you thought you would teach us fear. Her voice sharpened, cutting through the smoke like a blade. But humans don't fear death the way you do. We've made it an old companion, and a terrible teacher. Vex lurched toward the main console, frantic. Fire everything, he snarled. But there was nothing left to fire. Nothing left to shield them. The Dominance was a corpse with delusions of relevance. Zora Mox, bruised and bleeding, watched the sensors update with numbing inevitability. More human fleets, now moving toward hegemony borders with surgical precision. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to dismantle an empire. She remembered something her first commanding officer had once muttered after a particularly brutal campaign. When you piss off the wrong animal, you don't get a second chance to explain it was just a joke. Across the broken bridge, young Lieutenant Praise sobbed quietly as human boarding teams advanced. Vex sank into his chair like a man finally realizing the stage play was over, and he wasn't the hero. He wasn't even the villain. He was just a guy who burned a hospital ship and kicked off a war that humanity had spent millennia secretly preparing for, like vengeful farmers sowing seeds of retribution. Kapoor's final transmission came through as boarding pods locked onto the hull. You will live long enough to send a message back to your leaders, she said. A simple one. There was a pause, deliberate, cruel. We are not what you thought we were. The transmission cut out. Boarding teams breached the bridge with terrifying efficiency, soldiers in black armor moving like the inevitable hands of history. They didn't kill. They didn't even shout. They simply took the ship, silent and professional, as if repossessing a delinquent debtor's car. Zora surrendered without resistance, standing amid the ruins of what once was considered the most powerful warship in the quadrant. She looked around, at the wreckage of ambition, at the smoldering dreams of conquest. And with a deep, bone-weary sigh, she thought, well, on the bright side, at least nobody can accuse us of underestimating humanity again. High Counselor Drex Azeroth awoke to the sound of alarms. Not the ceremonial kind that blared during parades or state visits, polished and dignified. No. These were the ugly ones, the screaming, jagged klaxons that only ever meant two things, attack or apocalypse. As Azeroth stumbled into the war room, still pulling on the ornate robes of his office, the room's giant tactical display filled his field of vision. Not one, but 7 outer defense stations, gone. Silent. Dark. Wiped clean. He stared at the blinking voids like a man realizing too late that the termites had eaten through the foundation while he was busy admiring the drapes. Grand Admiral Pax Cora stood grim-faced beside the console, her scales dulled by stress. She didn't offer the usual salutes or pleasantries. There was no time left for old protocols. Only survival. They're human ships, she said bluntly. Hundreds of them. Their technology, it's beyond anything in our archives. Azeroth blinked, struggling to process the sheer impossibility. Earth has no such fleet, he insisted, clinging to old intelligence reports like a drunk clings to a broken bottle. Cora shrugged grimly. They didn't. Not publicly. The evidence was overwhelming, jump gates overrun, fleets emerging from secret routes the hegemony had believed undiscoverable. Entire sectors collapsing before the council could even draft a properly outraged memo. It wasn't a war. It was a reckoning. A transmission came through, a woman's voice, calm, merciless. This is Admiral Juno Kapoor of Earth Fleet Command. To the representatives of the Galactic Hegemony, your forces have committed atrocities. Your dominion ends today. Azeroth leaned heavily against the console. His mind, sharpened by decades of political maneuvering, raced through every possible response, diplomacy, bribery, threats. But deep inside, where no speechwriter could reach, he knew the truth. You don't negotiate with a volcano. You get out of the way. Or you burn. Admiral Cora cleared her throat awkwardly. There is, Perhaps room for negotiation, she offered hesitantly. The human reply was a masterpiece of brutal efficiency. We are not here to negotiate terms. We are here to impose them. Terms flashed across the screen. Withdrawal from all occupied worlds. Reparations. Permanent inspections. A new galactic council with humans at the table. Each demand stabbed at the heart of hegemony pride like a bayonet. Azeroth swallowed the bitter taste rising in his throat. It wasn't the loss of power that burned the most. It was the knowledge that they hadn't lost to a superior ideology or a divine force. They had lost to creatures who had spent most of their history inventing new and creative ways to kill each other, and then, horrifyingly, got better at it with practice. He thought of the old academy lectures. Of all the dusty professors who had scoffed at humanity's chaotic barbarism. Of the textbooks that had relegated Earth to the manageable list of civilizations. Manageable. The word echoed in his skull like a cosmic joke. Nearby, officers frantically whispered over readouts, more human fleets arriving by the minute. Entire defensive networks collapsing without a shot fired, sabotaged from within by cyber attacks so subtle the hegemony's proudest engineers hadn't even noticed until it was too late. What do we do, Counselor? Admiral Cora asked quietly. Azeroth closed his eyes. He thought about the children aboard the Mercy, their tiny hands clutching to hope. He thought about the way power, untempered by mercy, always turned inward eventually, eating itself alive. And he thought, bitterly, that if the hegemony had spent half as much time practicing compassion as they had perfecting oppression, they might not be standing on the edge of history's most humiliating footnote. When he opened his eyes, they were colder. We surrender, he said. The words were heavier than any world he had ever ruled. The transmission was accepted instantly. Admiral Kapoor appeared again, her expression unreadable. We accept your surrender. Compliance procedures begin immediately. As the war room dissolved into frantic orders and scrambling dignitaries trying to salvage their careers, Azeroth stood very still, a crumbling monument to everything the hegemony had once believed unshakable. He watched the human ships on the screen, forming perfect escort patterns to lead captured hegemony fleets away like cattle. He thought about how easily history forgot the mighty. And he wondered, not without a sour chuckle, if in 1,000 years' time, the most remembered fact about the glorious galactic hegemony would simply be: they lost an empire, to the species who once thought duct tape was a legitimate engineering solution. 6 months after the surrender, Captain Zilra Mox stood stiffly at the edge of the Galactic Council chamber, adjusting the unfamiliar cut of her new uniform. It wasn't armor anymore, just soft, formal fabric in neutral colors, designed to symbolize equality and cooperation and other lofty ideals that still tasted strange on her tongue. The council was a chaotic mess of voices, species, and languages, layered with the tense politeness of those who had, not long ago, pointed very large guns at each other. Above them all, projected in shimmering light, floated the new emblem. A red cross framed against a field of stars, the symbol of the newly formed interspecies medical corps. Mercy, it seemed, had grown teeth. Zilra watched as Admiral Juno Kapoor took her seat in the human delegation, composed and silent, her presence a cold reminder that mercy was not synonymous with weakness. That humanity, when given a choice between revenge and justice, had, somehow, against all odds, chosen the harder path. Zilra felt the weight of history pressing against her. And beneath that weight, a smaller, sharper ache, memory. She remembered the Mercy. Not just its destruction, but the way its last transmission had sounded, garbled, desperate, yet still somehow stubbornly hopeful, like a child trying to believe that monsters weren't real even as the shadows closed in. And now here she was, standing among the survivors of an empire built on arrogance, testifying to a new order she barely understood. Captain Mox, called Counselor Tekka of the Felian Union, his fur bristling politely, you served aboard the inevitable dominance during the incident that began the Liberation War. What is your perspective on those events? Zilra inhaled slowly. Words had always been weapons in the hegemony, crafted, honed, and wielded for maximum advantage. But now? Now honesty might be the sharpest blade she had left. She spoke plainly. The attack on the NSC Mercy was not just a tactical error, she said. It was the logical outcome of a system that viewed compassion as weakness and dominance as destiny. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Zora barely noticed. Her mind was adrift, not in the present, but in jagged flashes of memory. The smug laughter on the bridge as the Mercy burned. The stillness of Mars, not surrendering but calculating. The impossible sight of human fleets emerging from the dark like gods who had finally grown tired of prayers. She locked eyes with Admiral Kapoor across the room. The human nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, an acknowledgement, not of forgiveness, but of understanding. Zora continued. When the humans retaliated, they did not merely destroy our fleets. They dismantled the very assumptions that had sustained the hegemony for centuries. Her voice wavered, just for a heartbeat. They showed us that strength, real strength, is not about conquest. It is about restraint. About the ability to choose mercy when every wounded part of you demands blood. The council sat in heavy silence. Not because they doubted her, but because, deep down, many of them saw their own failures reflected back at them. The session concluded in a blur of formalities and signed resolutions. Later, Zora found herself alone in a quiet corridor, standing face to face with Admiral Kapoor. No guards. No posturing. Just two veterans of a war neither had wanted but had fought anyway. Admiral, Zora said hesitantly, I have to ask. After everything we did, after the Mercy, why didn't you destroy us? Kapoor studied her for a long moment. When you have the power to annihilate someone, she said finally, and you choose not to, it changes both of you. It reminds the victor what they're fighting for. And it gives the defeated a chance to become something better than they were. Zora nodded slowly. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was something close enough to live with. As Kapoor turned to leave, Zora called out softly. One more thing, Admiral. What if we make the same mistakes again? Kapoor smiled faintly, a smile that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with the bitter wisdom of a species that had survived its own worst impulses for millennia. Well, she said, walking away. Luckily for you, we humans always keep a few spare fleets lying around, just in case someone gets stupid twice. And so, with a fleet built in silence and fueled by rage, Earth didn't just win a battle. They dismantled an empire without losing their soul. They chose justice when they had every reason to choose revenge. But make no mistake, they made it very clear, mercy was now an earned privilege, not a guaranteed right. What would you have done? Chosen revenge or mercy? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. If you loved this story, hit like, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to HFY Sci-Fi Love and War Story. We have even more epic tales coming, where humanity's fire burns brighter than any star. Remember to type mercy or fury in the comments if you stayed with us until the end. I'll be looking for you there. Stay fierce, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next battle among the stars.